Well, welcome back to day two. I've been very much looking forward to moderating this session because the content of it affects all of us in our work in terms of the environment. And we're lucky that we've got a very knowledgeable speaker with us today, Annika Kroon. And let me just check. Annika, are you with us this morning?
I am with you in this
terrific.
beautiful morning.
Good morning, Annika. I hope we can hear you. You're coming through loud and clear, and we're delighted that you're able to join us. I'm feeling a bit lonely, actually. It'd be much nicer if you were here in person, but nevertheless, we much appreciate that you're with us. So, by way of introduction to your presentation, we're all aware of the need to reduce greenhouse emissions across maritime and logistics, and of the pathway to decarbonisation across the sector, but that it remains unclear, and it's a big challenge for our industry, whether we're talking about ports and terminals or whether we're talking about ships. But within the scope of its Green Deal, in alignment with the Paris Agreement, which is to set the benchmark and the level against which people refer to, the EU has launched its Fit for 55 package, which aims to reduce maritime emissions by 90% by 2015, which is quite a challenge. The package includes a number of measures, including but not limited to market-based action points, energy and technology deployment, and the revision of regulations and taxonomy aspects. These directives should provide regulatory predictability to industry stakeholders and hence incentivise early adopters to dive into the energy transition. Now, for those of us involved in the ports and terminals business, this process of decarbonisation is a lot easier when you've got a ready supply of electricity to your terminal that you can just plug into. It's a lot more difficult if you're running ships where they don't have that luxury. And they're going through the process of change at the moment, first of all with the reduction of SOx and NOx, and we're looking at interim fuels as part of that process, moving towards suitably sustainable fuels in the future. So I'm delighted that Annika's here, and I'm going to hand over to you, Annika, and we're really looking forward to the information and the guidelines you're going to give us today.
Thank you, Steve. And yes, I share your feeling. It's also a little bit lonely here in my office, and I planned to come, but at the end there were too many things happening in parallel, so I couldn't. But I have to say that Rotterdam is one of my favorite cities because it's just so rational somehow. Anyway, maybe there will be another opportunity, but thank you, and I'm very happy to kick off this Sustainability Day in TOC Europe. And yes, my objective today is to share with you some thoughts, or at least how on policy setting side we tried to make shipping fit for 55% emission reductions by 2030. But of course, it requires the effort on both industry side and policymakers. So, key talking points for today is indeed Fit for 55 package, which Steve had already briefly introduced, but we will go a bit deeper how it works, how different elements are bind together, and in particular, we'll focus on expansion of the emission trading system to maritime and fuel EU maritime regulation. I also mentioned infrastructure and fuel supply side. And then a little bit also how we can integrate and support this transition towards sustainable modes. So first, maybe start with the helicopter view. So in initiatives, Fit for 55 package, I think it had more than 13 initiatives within. Not everything there concerns maritime, but the purpose of package is to show how as economy as whole we can move to this 55% reduction of the emissions as set in the European climate target plan, to which all member states have subscribed. But maritime there includes some of the initiatives which are outlined in the scheme. So first, ETS, emission trading system. So ETS is now, according to the proposal in the package, extended to EU-bound maritime transport. Then AFID, or now in the revised version, AFIR stands for Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation, which deals with the supply of sustainable energy in transport. Then RED stands for Renewable Energy Directive, which means energy supply. ETD stands for Energy Taxation Directive, which gives additional incentives to sustainable energy or takes away unjustified benefits for fossil-based energy in our taxation systems. And then also importantly, at something where my service is in charge, my unit is in charge, is Fuel EU Maritime. So maybe I should have also introduced for those who have not read the bulletin that I'm heading the unit of maritime transport and logistics in mobility in Directorate General Mobility and Transport. So this Fuel EU is particular the initiative which we are dealing with. So why and where we stand and where we have to get. Steve already mentioned that maritime needs to reduce emissions by around 90%. That's how we can achieve economy-wide target of net zero by 2050. And abating maritime emission requires both. We have to improve energy efficiency. It means that we have to use less energy and fuel. And we have to use cleaner fuels, which means that we have to use renewable and low carbon fuels. To achieve it, we need a basket of measures. It's not one silver bullet which can solve all problems. And we also need a coordination at global level. So therefore, in this scheme comes back also the mentioning of IMO, because as you all know, maritime is a global business. What we do in EU only or regional measures, they affect the competitiveness of our shipping industry. Therefore, we are in parallel also pushing for same higher ambition at IMO level. So I would then dig a bit deeper into ETS emission trading system extension to maritime. First, the basics of the ETS as such. It's a cap and trade system, which puts a quantity limit of emissions for all sectors under the ETS. So maritime was not under ETS before, now it's brought under ETS, and the cap is reduced each year. So fixed number of allowances are issued, and all participants in the sectors have to monitor their emissions and surrender emissions enough to cover their actually emitted, to cover CO2. And if they don't have enough allowances, they can buy them on the market, which means that key benefit of this measure is that it's flexible and cost effective. It means that if you are a sector which can easily abate, then you would prefer to abate instead of buying allowances. And for those parts of economy where abatement is very expensive, they can still buy allowances until the price of these allowances gets too high and they prefer to abate. So that gives a price signal in economy that how we gradually can move towards net zero. And also the revenue generated by auctioning and buying allowances will be invested back to those sectors which are hard to abate. Some allowances go back to member states, others are kept in the innovation fund and provided for, let's say, common European projects with a major scalability for economic sectors. In maritime, what it means is that the same principles of the ETS apply as for other sectors. Shipping companies will have to monitor their emissions and purchase and surrender ETS emissions for each ton of the reported CO2. And CAP is derived from 2018-19 data, and it adjusted in every year its linear reduction by 4.2%. given that the Maritime was not part of the ETS system before, so it will not be covered as from outset 100%. There will be phase-in period, smooth transition. So if proposal gets adopted, then by next year, it covers 20% of reported emissions, and reporting is under MRV, monitoring reporting verification regulation, which is already in place. And then it will gradually increase until 100% of shipping emission until 2026. The scope is, yes, it's covering only ships above 5,000 gross tonnage. It means the bigger vessels. We cover with that about 55% of fleet, but we capture 90% of emissions. So as I mentioned, it's around 2/3 of all EU maritime transport related emissions, but the scope is all emissions from voyages within the EU, intra-EU, and all emissions within the ports at berth in EU ports, and 50% of emissions from voyages starting or ending in EU, between EU and third countries. And scope is consistent with the international environmental principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And I mentioned already that reporting comes from MRV. Greenhouse gases are defined as in regulation 757, so it's the main greenhouse gas emissions. There is also a review clause because, again, recalling that shipping is a global business, if IMO adopts standards which allow us to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, then of course we in Europe intend to align with the IMO, and negotiations on this regards are ongoing. At the moment, you may have heard from last week, there was the session on IMO, where actually agreement on new energy efficiency measures for ships was achieved, and progress on discussion on revision of IMO greenhouse gas strategy and start of phase 2 was achieved also. And the EU is pushing for revised and more ambitious strategy at IMO level for greenhouse gas emission reduction up to 100% by 2050, which is even going a bit beyond of the current target in EU policies. But that's because in EU policies we can seek for economy-wide net zero, but in IMO we can't, let's say, control the emission reductions in other economic sectors. So therefore in IMO and Maritime, we have proposed a strategy and objective with 100% emission reduction by 2050. But of course it's hard, negotiations still ahead. But the purpose is to keep the competitiveness of the sector at the global level. So now about FuelEU Maritime, which is the file under our supervision. So where we come from with the FuelEU Maritime. ETS is a market, if I jump back to ETS, it's a market-based measure, and it's at this level of carbon price. It probably will not yet in next 10 years incentivize the uptake of more advanced alternative fuels. And therefore we really have to put measures in place on the demand side. To reach climate targets, the maritime sector, as said, has to reduce emissions close to 90%, but today fossil fuels are about 99% of the total fuel mix in maritime. So it really needs to be kickstart the change there on the type of fuels used. And we have seen that there is no one technological option, but we have a large variety of ship types and operating models, and operators as well as fuel suppliers and distributors have been locked in this wait and see attitude. and there is a coordination failure between those. So therefore, in Fit for 55 package, if I jump quickly back there in our first big scheme, there we have to tackle different elements of this ecosystem or at the same moment. So Fuel EU is tackling demand, red, Renewable Energy Directive is tackling supply of alternative fuels, and AFIR is tackling the distribution. So we have infrastructure, we have supply, and we have demand. So all these elements are covered. And we hope to get out of this wait and see moment. Obligations must be imposed, therefore, on demand and distribution, as well as distribution and supply. There are long lead times in the sector, both for fleet renewal as well as building and providing infrastructure. So we need immediate but yet gradual action. And we keep, the goal is to complement ETS. ETS is about energy efficiency mostly. And now with the Fuel EU, we tackle the fuel supply side and demand, supply and demand. And we intend to give a regulatory predictability so that sector knows what is coming and then can start to ramp up investments gradually. Plus, we at the same time continue parallel negotiations at the IMO level, and the EU submission on IMO on greenhouse gas fuel standard reflects the principles of the Fuel EU Maritime proposal, and also the guidelines on well-to-wake greenhouse gas emissions means that we look at energy life cycle of the fuels, not just tank-to-wake or direct emissions. It's also coherent with Fuel EU Maritime approach. So now about the main elements of how this piece of legislation, which is, I would say, quite groundbreaking, looks like. So focus is on fuel and demand, but other aspects, as I mentioned, are covered elsewhere. It is very importantly technology neutral. I said we don't have one solution, and there is even no point of having one solution because business models and requirements differ. And maritime operators will need increasing proportion of zero and low carbon sustainable fuels without obligation to use a specific technology. Therefore, we just monitor and regulate, setting targets on yearly average greenhouse gas intensity of the energy used on board. And at first, the targets are very modest. 2025, we start with -2%, and 2030 still modest, -6%, but then it speeds up because we hope that by that time the investments have been ramped up, the market has found its way, and we have also had time to see how the prices of energy evolve. And by 2050, the energy intensity has to be reduced by 75%. It includes all main greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, and it's well-to-wake basis, also important principle, energy life cycle. So given that we enter into territory which is quite new and there are high uncertainties about availability of the fuels as well as the price, there are several flexibility mechanisms built into this proposal. There is yearly average, so it's not every bunkering operation where you have to meet the targets, but it's a yearly average. So you may have a sustainable fuel supply in one port, and you can actually with that meet the requirements. Then targets are established in 5-year intervals. As I said, they speed up later. Scopes is the same as ETS, only bigger vessels and 50% of international voyages and 100% of EU voyages. There are additional flexibility mechanisms for banking and borrowing. So if you have a little surplus or small deficit, you can carry it over to next year. And it's also importantly possible to pool within a company or with other companies. So if there is one advanced vessel which uses, for example, renewable fuels of non-biological origin, this vessel in principle can sell its compliance potential to other vessels in the pool. And with that, we intend to reward over compliance and give, let's say, extra incentive for investments to these very advanced technologies. If operator does not comply, it will be subject to financial penalty, and revenues from the penalties are intended to use to investments into renewable fuels in maritime sector. And monitoring is based on MRV. Also, there is a principle of report only once approach, so that if operators report for Fuel EU Maritime, they also report at the same time for ETS. Responsible entity is the same as under the ISM code. And there is additional element in the regulation that to tackle the air quality in ports, it also applies the obligation onshore power supply with a certain flexibility and transitional provisions for container and passenger vessels. These are the vessels which have the highest energy demand and technical feasibility to use OPS already, but there are also, of course, transitional measures to be sure that ports are ready, regulated in AFIR, and that these energy grids which supply energy to ports will be available. So there are several flexibility mechanisms for that. So I will very shortly now also give you a couple of points on alternative fuels infrastructure regulation, which sets the criteria and availability targets for infrastructure of alternative fuels for all modes, but for maritime specifically, it says that major TEN-T ports, depending on the number of calls of passenger ships and container ships, have obligation to provide OPS connections by certain date, and all TEN-T ports have to provide LNG bunkering. And Renewable Energy Directive also ramps up targets for EU level renewable energy, which has to be 40% by 2030. Just for comparison, at the moment, the percentage is just under 20%. So it means that within next 8 years, it has to double. It could be that there will be further upping of ambition in the light of current attempts to deconnect European energy from Russian supply. So it could be still revised upwards. That's a discussion between the politicians at the moment. But and then for transport, Renewable Energy Directive sets a specific target across all modes, reduction of greenhouse gas intensity by 13% by 2030. And it has sub-target for renewable fuels of non-biological origin of 2.6%. The new directive also tightens the criteria for bioenergy. I did not mention, but that's actually the part of the Fuel EU that it does not recognize biofuels of first generation, which means that emission factors of such fuels are considered equal to those of fossil fuels. Reason being there that if we use first generation biofuels, we actually reduce carbon sink, and it may be counterproductive to emission reduction. So how we integrate and support these measures, because it's a major transition and we need to also see how the industry can be supported. One thing I wanted to mention here is a research partnership in the framework of Horizon Europe program for develop and deploy zero-emission waterborne transport solution. The objective is there that main ship types and services all have a, let's say, marketable solutions for zero-emission propulsions by 2030. Research call topics are announced every year by the European Commission, depending on the results of previous years. First call was, I think, launched last year, in the middle of the last year, 2021. And then projects are evaluated and selected projects get EU co-funding. It also aims to strengthen the European shipbuilding industry so that we are the first movers in the world on this type of technologies, and maybe we can win back certain markets from Asian shipyards, for example, where we have lost the competitiveness in recent years. And it also looks at what type of implementation, regulation, policies and standards are necessary to facilitate the uptake of these technologies. Then second initiative, supporting and being a major flanking measure for fuel EU Maritime, as well as refuel aviation, which is a similar type of initiative for aviation fuels. Those two, maritime and aviation, being sectors hard to decarbonize, in a transport in particular hard to decarbonize, is a renewable and low carbon fuels value chain alliance. This is a new initiative focusing on boosting production and supply of renewable fuels, renewable and low carbon fuels for waterborne and aviation. It has like two roundtables, one for aviation, one for maritime, but there are also common interest and common parts for both modes. And the alliance brings together stakeholders from across the transport fuel value chain, from sourcing to end users, and it also looks at the technology and finance providers, so that to identify where are the bottlenecks to make supply available for sustainable fuels, and also how to bring the prices down by scalability of production. Because there are already mature technologies in the maritime where actually just supply and price is a question. So then there are, of course, several financing and funding facilities available. Being conscious of time, I will not go through all of those in detail today, because that would be another 15 minutes. But just very quickly saying that Connecting Europe facility number 2, it's focusing mostly on infrastructure, but it has also a part of its funds made available for alternative fuels infrastructure facility, which is kind of blended instrument, and is targeted really on setting up of alternative fuel infrastructure, and including LNG bunkering in ports. And it can also be made available for to the limited extent for vessels which are necessary to get a critical mass for certain type of infrastructure provision. For example, that if you need a methanol bunkering facility, then you need also methanol fueled vessels to use it. So there can be find a possibility to co-finance both. Then InvestEU has a broad range of financial instruments to support sustainable investments. That another blended initiative, which means that part of it is subsidies, but part of it is coming from industry. Recovery Resilience Facility, which was put in place to recover from COVID slowdown. So with that, we have to build back better, and we intend to invest major part of this money, at least now after current energy crisis, is intended now to be directed into sustainable energy sources, again to disconnect us from Russian energy. Horizon Europe, I already mentioned, it's a research and innovation facility. Innovation Fund is fed by revenues from ETS auctions, and is intended again to support large-scale decarbonization projects. And also maritime transport is already available, even though not yet quite in not yet in the scope of ETS, but in cooperation or in the ecosystem view with energy supply and distribution, maritime transport actually can submit projects already to Innovation Fund. And then European Investment Bank Group, including European Innovation Fund, has its own operations and schemes to support sustainable transformation, including, for example, retrofitting. Then there are state aid guidelines for environmental protection and energy, which member states can use. And then there is EU Green Taxonomy, which was mentioned by Steve. So I will very quickly just introduce you the principle of taxonomy framework. This taxonomy is actually not part of the Fit for 55, but the taxonomy regulation was put in place already 2 years ago in 2020, but it is at the moment in the stage of implementation still. So the point being there that to find a common system to say which type of investments or economic activity is sustainable. So what we can label as green, because otherwise everyone sets their own standards and there is no assurance for investors or whether the money they prefer to invest into green project is actually used to this purpose. So the taxonomy regulation sets the broad framework where this says that economic activity or investment is green if it contributes substantially to at least one of 6 environmental objectives, and I will get back to that. It does not significantly harm in other environmental objectives, and it complies with minimum social safeguards. The major challenge is now, of course, and has been since the adoption of the regulation, to define what is contributes substantially and what does not significantly harm. So for that, there is ongoing effort by the Platform on Sustainable Finance to define criteria, technical screening criteria. And this is the so-called actual taxonomy on which basis this assessment can be made. So here are these 6 environmental objectives which taxonomy considers. It's climate change and climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. Their first delegated act, which defines criteria, was adopted in 2021, and maritime operations is part of those criteria. And then work is now ongoing on other 4 criteria, which is sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, transition to circular economy, pollution prevention, and protection of the biodiversity. So this is a high helicopter view of taxonomy, which I have to admit is very complex framework. The initial idea of Commission was that it can be kept strictly science and science-based and measurable, but it has grown into quite a political initiative. So that has slowed down a lot the development around it. And yes, we'll see how it goes. But at least on climate adaptation and mitigation part, I think, yes, the criteria are there. They, of course, need to be developed further in the light of policy development. Even if I just take the example of FuelEU Maritime, where we take for fuels now life cycle approach, taxonomy still is looking at only the tailpipe emissions. So it means that as soon as FuelEU Maritime will be adopted, taxonomy criteria, of course, have to reflect this policy development. So that's what I had prepared for you in the main parts of the developments for sustainable maritime, and happy to hear your comments and questions.
Annika, thank you very much indeed for leading us through a great deal of quite complex information. For people like yourself that will be familiar with all these acronyms, it's familiar territory, but for many of us here in the audience, and I can tell from the expressions on their faces, that and a lot of this is new territory, so it's quite difficult to absorb all this information. So I'm hoping that Matteo is going to confirm that your presentation will be available.
Yes.
We're getting their thumbs up, so I guess they'll be on the TOC website in the next couple of days. So you will be able to come back to Annika's very informative presentation and reread it so that some of this information starts to sink in. There's no such thing as a stupid question this morning. And I think I can be confident in saying the same about the answers, Annika. But who would like to ask a first question? Down at the front here. I think there's a microphone coming from Matteo.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Annika, for that great presentation. I'm Christopher Stanek from NOW in Germany, and I have two questions. The first one is regarding the FuelEU Maritime, and as you know, we have made a proposal together with the Danish colleagues for a sub-quota of RFNBOs also in the FuelEU Maritime. Maybe you can say something about the status quo to that, how it looks like, the votes from the other member states. And on the other hand, I have a question regarding the taxonomy regulation. And as you have said, the taxonomy is only figuring a zero-emission tailpipe perspective. And as we heard a lot from maritime industry, and especially for shipbuilding industries, it is a problem because they have a lot of sustainable products regarding the life cycle approach. And we have, on the other hand, also the production of synthetic fuels, etc. On the other hand, and there has to be an incentive from our perspective to have also there installed a kind of life cycle approach. Thank you.
Thank you. So, renewable fuels of non-biological origin and sub-quota in FuelEU Maritime. First, state of play, the general approach, which was adopted by the member states in Council on 2nd of June, included the sub-quota for renewable fuels of non-biological origin. So we understand the purpose, we share the intention, because the production and supply of these fuels needs to be ramped up, because in long term this is the solution, because after 2035 the only way to comply with the targets is to use this type of fuels. At the same time, the general approach includes a multiplier, not sub-quota. So, and I explain what is the difference. Sub-quota would mean that every operator has to comply with has to use certain amount of renewable fuels of non-biological origin, or has to use the pooling mechanism with other vessels who use this type of fuels. So this is quite a strict condition at this stage for operators who run the traditional fleet, which will be still around for a long time. So therefore, we in the Commission side were very cautious about sub-target. We are more open, but of course Commission at this stage has a reserve on all its position, but we are open, and we can see that multiplier could have a good effect. It means that using renewable fuels of non-biological origin, they are counted as 1.5, so you get 50% of more compliance if you use these fuels for certain time period. The problem, of course, there is that if you use multipliers, that it dilutes a little bit the overall targets. But we don't know how much these fuels will be available in coming years. If there will be large quantities, then we of course have to raise the overall targets. If quantities will be limited, then of course it's not necessary. But we hope that quantities will increase quickly, because that's the purpose. So, in summary, we are very cautious about the sub-target. Because, if I take a traditional vessel, then the only way to comply is to use a drop-in e-diesel, which is the most expensive. But maybe these multipliers could be helpful indeed. Then taxonomy and zero emission. We are very well aware that taxonomy now builds on tailpipe, but back 2019 when these criteria were developed and 2020. And since now, it's actually the approach also at IMO level that they look only at tailpipe emission. Only, as I mentioned before, now there are guidelines to life cycle type of calculations in IMO. As IMO evolves, but definitely as fuel EU evolves, we will include the life cycle in taxonomy. But I wanted to emphasize that it's not true that at the moment only zero emission vessels are compliant under taxonomy, because there is also criterion on best in class. We call a best in class criterion, which means that if you perform 10% better than IMO energy efficiency indices, I mean the EDI and EXI, then you can be compliant. So there is another way beyond zero emission.
On the subject of interim stages where we're seeing ships go to LNG and LPG, I mean, they produce a big reduction in SOx and NOx, but they still produce.
I think the transitional fuels are absolutely necessary, given that we don't have yet this silver bullet, or even we don't have these 3 different silver bullets that will take us to the zero emission. And as mentioned, that the vessels run 20 to 30 years, and existing fleet needs an option to comply during this period. So these transitional fuels, including LNG, remain important. We have calculated that with LNG, it's possible to stay compliant, having LNG and also OPS, onshore power supply. These 2 contribute to the targets, and with that it's possible to comply until about 2035, in condition that you have a best LNG engine. So the energy conversion is really excellent to the extent that there is no fugitive methane emissions. So then LNG can help to comply. After that, indeed, you have to start to blend your LNG with biomethane or e-methane, because the targets get harsher. But the positive is that there is no lock-in into carbon-intensive assets. You can still use the same vessels, you can still use the same bunkering infrastructure. You just have to change the energy which is used there. So therefore, we see that LNG is quite a viable option for transition, also in long term.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I thought Mr. Fossey had fallen asleep, but clearly he was thinking, because he's got a question.
Yeah, Annika, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. John Fossey, World Cargo News. You mentioned about the ships that do not meet the greenhouse gas limitations and so on would be subjected to deterrent financial penalties. On what basis will those financial penalties be calculated?
That's to the extent that, of course, it will be taken into account how much you miss your target, and then according to that, there is a formula which sets the size of the penalty, which can be quite significant. The point being there is that it has to be. It should not be a way to comply with the targets. So the penalty might be much harsher than buying sustainable fuel and being compliant. So it's really has to be deterrent. Of course, I said apply the formula, but what happens before the formula? There is a full, the monitoring and verification process has been defined in the regulation, which means that the operators have to start by setting their monitoring plan, selecting verifier who will verify the data which they have recorded. Verifier will do the calculations if, and there is in the Middle East, Fuel EU Maritime database based on TETI's MRV. on which basis all these records are saved and shared by member state authorities. And in case the targets are not met, then the member state authorities then will announce the penalty to the operator, and the operator can of course then either pay the penalty to have a compliance certificate, or if it disagrees, then file a complaint with the member state or ask for a review by verifier. So that's a quite big bit of this regulation and goes into much detail on every step how it happens. But I would like to say that enforceability of this legislation is a key for environmental regulation to really work. That part is really important, and that's actually, I have to admit, the main part of the negotiations we had in the council with the member states to really ensure that enforcement part is watertight.
Thank you, Annika. I hope that's the answer you wanted, John. Just before we wrap up, I've got a live example for you to comment on, Annika. I'm literally talking to a client that's about to buy 10 bulk carriers, and he's looking at whether he buys second-hand or whether he buys new. And before all this came along, you went to the different engine manufacturers. They're all going to be burning the same fuel. You looked at the engine outputs and the performance, and it was the process of comparison and making decisions was really easy. It's a lot more complicated now, and as your last answer demonstrated, there are frameworks and concepts, but they still need to be populated with a lot of detail. But in the same time, at the moment, people are having to make decisions about what sort of engines to put in the ships that they're about to buy, or if they're buying second-hand ships, which ones do they select that are most likely to be cost-effective in fitting in as the regulations come into force. So how does somebody that is about to invest in buying ships today work that all out, and where can they go to get this information? Because one engine manufacturer may be saying one thing in terms of we're going hydrogen, and another one may be saying, well, we think it's ammonia. So it's not so simple anymore. So how do ship owners, and where can they go to gather the information so they can make the right informed decisions?
Yeah, I think that it depends. So as I said, there are different solutions for different types of vessels and different types of operating models. For ocean going, it's ammonia or methanol. For short sea shipping, probably Patereys will be there. I saw recently a very interesting model of a ro-ro ship which was fully powered by wind. It was very exciting, but there is no single solution, and I don't think that bureaucrats should tell the ship owners which is the right one. But I really strongly believe, and just yesterday I was in the event of Eurogas and got a strong confirmation both from suppliers and ship operators that this technology neutrality principle is important, and at the end market will sort it out better than legislators to tell which model works best for which type of operation or vessel. So I don't have a clear answer for you, but I would say that LNG at the moment, if you're a small ship owner and you have to fit yourself into ecosystem, then LNG is something that should keep you alive next 15 years. As I said, 10 years by having a good engine. Please check that it has a good energy conversion system, and then after that blending the gaseous fuels. But then at the same time I see that Maersk has made a bet for methanol. Other companies make different bets, so it's, I think, even for big players important to have a different bets because of fuel supply. If everyone will go to methanol, then there will be short of methanol. So therefore, it's good that if at least big companies make a different bets and take a different direction. And I have to say that we also important there is a review clause in the regulation, which we propose to have in 2030, but legislators have suggested that it should be brought forward by 2027. And that's really important because that's the time to take stock what has happened in the market and be then made to adjust. But also it could imply that we actually bring in the sub-target for renewable fuels of non-biological origin, or we increase slightly the overall targets. But it's the intention indeed is to see what happens, because this decarbonization pressure is not only for maritime or not only for transport, it's for the whole economy. And the market powers will definitely shift in coming years.
Annika, thank you very much indeed. And before we formally draw the session to a close, and thank you for being with us, and we hope that in future years you can be with us in person to update us, and we can have a proper discussion over a glass of something afterwards, which is where the important information gets exchanged. I should let you know that at 12 o'clock, continuing on this theme, there's a session on energy transition, which may answer some of the questions this morning, where we've got 4 speakers involved in green marine performance, global sustainability, which is IKEA, somebody who's head of environmental improvement for AP Moller-Maersk, and a speaker from the port of Rotterdam as well. So thank you for being here. Great to see you. And maybe see some of you for the session at 12 o'clock. I'll be back this afternoon looking at developing markets. And in the meantime, Annika, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. Have a good continuation.